Sir George Bingham, too, left in May 1819, despite the benefits and limelight of being adjutant general on St. Helena. Truth to tell, for fear of quarreling with the governor, he was scarcely ever seen at Longwood, but he always on the best of terms with the French, and Lady Bingham, who had rejoined him, was an invaluable help to poor Madame Bertrand. The latter scarcely left the little house where she was confined, and was seldom seen at the Emperor's residence, where the Emperor spent almost all his time in his room, attired in a dressing gown with his head covered with a handkerchief, and she no longer received any visits from the wives of officers of the camp at Longwood. Since the awful affair between Lieutenant Colonel Leicester and the Grand Marshal, this Leicester, whom Lowe brought with him, and who probably had been a regimental companion, but who for a considerable time had not been identified with the regular army, had assumed the duties of inspector of the volunteers, with the local rank of lieutenant colonel. Lowe had conceived the idea of appointing him orderly officer at Longwood, with lieutenant under him. The Emperor, when he was informed that Leicester had been in service with a Corsican regiment at Ajaccio, and that he was not reckoned as being in the army, was furious and got Bertrand to write a letter to the governor, couched in very strong terms. The governor was foolish enough to show the letter to Leicester, who had set out for Longwood, looking in the most unmannerly fashion for a quarrel with O'Meara. When he was made cognizant of this complaint against his appointment, Leicester immediately sent Bertrand a challenge in which he insulted in terms of lowest vulgarity not only the Grand Marshal, but the Emperor himself. When Bertrand did not reply to this provocation, Lieutenant Colonel Leicester followed it up the following day with a letter threatening to flog him if he did not apologize. Bertrand sent these communications to the governor with a letter dictated by the Emperor. Lowe had to make excuses and withdrew Leicester from Longwood, but he did not proceed with the astonishing affair wherein an inspector volunteers while on duty had had a difference with an imprisoned lieutenant general and had endeavored by his insults to force him to fight. It seems Lowe did not even send Leicester's letters to Lord Bathurst, nor that which he himself sent to Grand Marshal, and out of friendship for his old regimental comrade, he failed in a serious manner to do his duty. To all this he added meanness. He seized the opportunity of making the officers on the island to understand, officers of His Majesty's regular army, they were under command of Lieutenant Colonel Leicester, a local officer appointed by himself, and that they and their wives were to send poor Madame Bertrand to Coventry. Lowe had his reasons for these miserable annoyances. He devoted himself to the complete isolation of Madame Bertrand, to making her existence on St. Helena so unbearable that she would persuade her husband to let her go, with the result that the Grand Marshal would certainly accompany her. With Bertrand out of the way, all would be well. Madame Bertrand was always of a sociable nature. She had always lived in society. Society was indispensable to her. She could never quite bring herself to obeying where she had hitherto commanded, and was consequently not too well disposed towards the Emperor, whom she rarely saw and never took any interest, so to speak, in the life at Longwood. She had had the misfortune to lose her mother, who died in Paris on October 20th, 1817, and as the news did not reach her until 3 months later, how she regretted not holding the Grand Marshal to the promise he had made of not staying at St. Helena longer than a year. She would at least have seen her mother again, whom she had left at such a cost, and must she not have been deeply devoted to her English family, since she gave the name of her father, Arthur Dillon, to that little boy born at St. Helena under the Emperor's very eyes, the first Frenchman, as she said, had to enter the island without permission from the English and asked Lady Jerningham to be his godmother. She was very English, being, with the exception of Bouge, attended by English servants and speaking only English to the children. The departure of Lady Bingham followed by that of Lady Malcolm, with whom she was so intimate that she entrusted very personal letters to her for her English relatives, afflicted her sorely. She was constantly ill, and after 2 or 3 miscarriages, she had given birth to little Arthur on January 9th, 1817, but then in less than 19 months, she had 3 accidents, each of which had nearly proved fatal. She remained weak to the end of her life. She could scarcely get up to dress herself and very rarely went out, staying nearly all day in bed, and that little miniature-like house resounded with the noise of her children, to whom she was devotedly attached, but who grew up as they liked. They were at least natural, intelligent, and animated. They feared nothing and went everywhere at the moment. There were 4, all wild: Napoleon, Henri, Hortense, and Arthur, who, although he was the smallest and could only jabber English, was no less sturdy. The emperor had real affection for them, and, if it can be so called, a reflective affection. His love was shown by the fondness for children, always noticeable in him from the moment his character took a serious mien, a kind of rough, almost rude affection, giving preference to stoical children who were self-denying, intelligent, and vigorous, and a reflective love when he saw in them the representation of his own son. He was sort of ashamed, so to speak, of his son. He spoke of his past, that is to say, his birth. He spoke of his future, of the chances he had of reigning, but very rarely, hardly ever, of his present position. His mind turned aside from him, as from some very painful experience. He never mentioned him in fun and avoided being moved to pity, but whenever he looked at one of the Bertrand's children, did he not conjure up visions of the little fair-haired, blue-eyed boy, that fatherless child who was growing up in that Schönbrunn, where he was no longer permitted to mention the name of him who twice established his headquarters there? How he played with the Bertrand's children and spoiled them and delighted in making them happy, so much so that he suggested to Pierron that he should resume his old employment of cook, to make sweets to please the children and to put them according to their different kinds in pretty cardboard boxes. And further, he planned to pierce little Hortense's ears with a larding pin to fit her with coral earrings, and so on, learning how she envied her brother Napoleon, who occasionally rode by her carriage. He had her measured for her riding habit by the wife of Novaras, and some days later he had her dressed up, seated her on the Frichon, and Archambault led the horse along under Madame Bertrand's window. The latter was obliged to take it in good part. From that time, Hortense and her brother rode with His Majesty. One morning, when Hortense, dressed in a yellow dress of a nasty shade and shabby material, went into the Emperor's room, he said to her, "You're badly dressed today." "Sire," replied the Grand Marshal, "the dress was bought in St. Helena, and there is but a poor choice." "Wait a moment, Hortense," said the Emperor. "I will give you something to make a pretty jacket with." And he sent Marchand to look for a coat of red velvet with gold and silk trimming, one of the 4 which in 1800 had been offered to the first consul by the town of Lyon. Words cannot describe the brilliance and the delicate coloring of the material and the exquisite gold embroidery in green and yellow silk. He had worn this jacket the day he had signed the Concordat, and the day he visited the factory of the Savin brothers at Rouen. Gerard and Isabelle had made it. He took this jacket, pregnant with glory, and put it on the little girl's shoulder, saying, "You will be beautiful in that at least."